Our next speaker is Dr. Bruno Tertrais from the Foundation for Strategic Research in France. He received his doctorate in political science from the Institut d'études politiques de Paris in 1994. He was before that the director of Civilian Affairs Committee at NATO Assembly in Brussels. He subsequently joined the policy division of the French Ministry of Defense, and between 1996 and 2001 was the special assistant to the director of strategic affairs in the French Ministry of Defense. More recently, he was a member of the French Presidential Committee on Defense and Security and a member of the French Ministerial Commission on Foreign and European Policy. He's the author of many publications, including War Without End, which was published in 2005. He's a contributing editor to two leading journals, Survival and the Washington Quarterly, and in 2010 he was the recipient of the Vauban Prize. Today he's going to speak to us about the French experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Apologies for my voice. I'd like to thank most warmly Ephraim Inbar for having invited me for two reasons. Because he then forced me to make up my mind about this idea of, is there a French conception of the use of force, an idea that I had not previously thought about for at least for some time since I was in the Ministry of Defense. The second reason is that, and that as a transition to the last session this morning, I'm increasingly worried, as I'm sure many of you are, by the tendency in Western societies, in particular in Europe and in the United States to some extent, to make a confusion between intentional killing and non-intentional killing about war casualties and deliberate targeting of civilians. That, I think, is a profoundly worrying development in Western societies and a sign, unfortunately, of societies that tend to lose their moral compass. So I'm particularly grateful to Ephraim for convening, and to your colleagues for convening this event. 2 months ago, France saw itself being engaged in simultaneous combat operations on 3 different fronts, in Afghanistan, in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, and then in Libya. So what was happening? In 2003, we were the axis of weasels, and then 7 years later, we are the gung-ho, hawkish neocons. Well, of course, the reality is more complex than it seems, as an analyst is supposed to say. I'm going to try to give you an answer, and also try to give you an answer to the question that I posed myself. Is there a specific French conception of the use of force? And I'm not certain that there is. And I will begin with a comparison, because it seems to me, but my British colleague will tell me if I'm wrong, that in fact we have, in our conception of the use of force, many things in common with our British friends and allies. I mean, these are 2 medium-sized countries where we used to think ourselves as great powers, but let's face it, we are medium-sized countries, which share a strong military tradition, modest but well-equipped and well-trained military forces, some form of global political and diplomatic ambitions, a colonial past, and whether we like it or not, I think this has a very strong influence on our military culture, permanent membership of the UN Security Council, I think that matters too, an independent nuclear deterrent, I think that does matter too, because it makes it easier for political authorities to have confidence that if they send their forces somewhere, whatever happens and however the crisis evolves, then their vital interests will be protected. And since we have the luxury of not facing any major permanent military threat anymore, we can afford, both London and Paris can afford to fight for our, quote, values as much as for our interests. And indeed, London and Paris have quite often fought side by side on many theaters of operations since the early 90s, from the Balkans to Central Asia. Where the UK and France, I think, part company, so to say, is on 2 points. One, the fact that France remains heavily committed towards its former colonies, that is, Africa, but also, Lebanon also. And also a strong willingness in Paris to enshrine military operation in an EU context, European Union context, as much as possible, although it has proven fairly difficult so far. Leaving aside the decolonization period, and after 1962, most French military operations have taken place essentially to help or protect friendly governments of former colonies, or protect the numerous French citizens on the African continent. We've had very few multinational operations during the Cold War, except for one, which was a very important one because of the number of casualties, and you are all familiar with it because it was the multinational force in Lebanon, where we had 58 deaths when the Hezbollah attacked our military barracks, and this left a deep mark, a deep imprint in French military psyche. This was the Dakar camp bombing in 1983. Things have completely changed since the end of the Cold War. As a result of the rejuvenation of the UN Security Council, the creation of the European Union, and the fact that NATO, to which we are a member, began intervening increasingly in non-collective defense operations, most French interventions today take place in a multinational context, be it blue helmets or ad hoc coalitions or NATO or EU. And there has been a doubling of French military operations. On average, we had, I think, about 15 between 1962 and 1990, and then we had 30 operations, 30 significant operations between 1990 and 2010. So that's a doubling for a lesser amount of time. We now have about 30,000, between 20,000 and 40,000 soldiers permanently outside the French territory in Europe, although half of them are actually in our overseas territories. Most French operations today, again, are in a multinational context. That includes also increasingly operations in Africa, because that's one of the emerging changes in the French conception of the use of force, is that we are slowly, because it's a very difficult process politically, and that's a polite way to put it. I think there is a slow movement away from the traditional French operations in Africa. I think there are three characteristics in the French use of military force. One is one that you are very familiar with, is the French insistence on the role of the United Nations as the main vehicle for preserving peace and security. That's of course due to the fact that Paris is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, but there is also a deep-seated belief, whether it's misguided or not is a different issue, a deep-seated belief that only the United Nations can help, having some kind of checks and balances system in the checks and balances mechanism in the international system. That includes checking U.S. power, of course, but not only U.S. power. I mean, a check against the power of the biggest countries. The second one is an intense attachment to the right of self-defense. Any of you who is familiar with the French nuclear strategy and doctrine would know that in the French nuclear deterrence strategy, the right to self-defense overrides any legal commitment you may have one way or the other to protect your vital interests. In other words, if your vital interests are at stake, basically international law goes through the window. And I'm ready to submit, or at least to suggest, that it's in fact the case for most, if not all, nuclear-armed countries. But at least the French are fairly explicit about it. That was for the nuclear part, but then it's also true for most of our defense commitments. Again, the right to self-defense, be it individual or collective, is quasi-sacred in the French view. That includes the defense of our allies. Interestingly, when France was outside the military command of NATO, that's between 1968 and 2008, the commitment to come to the security of any alliance member who would have been threatened remained as strong, if not stronger. In fact, at that time, and some of you may remember that, in fact, at that time, de Gaulle liked to present himself as, I don't trust the Americans enough to come to my defense if I am attacked, but I can tell you, and that's what he told President Kennedy in 1962, if the United States is attacked, we will be the first to come to their defense. It's the famous sentence to the Soviet ambassador who came to see de Gaulle and say, well, you should not, you should not show too much solidarity with the United States, because you never know, you might be a target too. And they said, well, Mr. Ambassador, we will die together. And that's what he said in 62. And that's pretty much the same thing that happened in 2001, where France was actually the first country to start drafting a UN resolution next to the burning towers of the World Trade Center a few hours after the attacks. Now, a footnote regarding this country, Israel. You are all familiar with the infamous speech by de Gaulle in 1967, where he made not so very nice comments about the Jewish people. Few people have read that speech in its entirety. It's actually worth noting, because in that same speech he says something that I quote from memory: of course, if Israel was attacked, we would come to its defense. So interestingly, he had, again, this very ambivalent, ambiguous attitude vis-à-vis one of its allies. And that sympathy, that commitment to Israel's defense actually was reformulated in a much more clearer way by Sarkozy when he was here 3 years ago. The third element is a commitment to defend by force if needed, and when, and only when circumstances allow it, civilian populations against the risk of a humanitarian disaster. This is an essential reason, though not the only one, though certainly not the only one, to explain why Paris was at the forefront of action in the ex-Yugoslavia in 91-92, Rwanda in 94, and I can personally testify to the fact that despite the controversy, the instructions given to our armed forces in 94 were very clearly geared towards the prevention of further genocide, or the continuation of genocide. In Bosnia in 95, in Kosovo in 99, along with most of our allies, or more recently in Ivory Coast and Libya, as well as many other instances on the African continent in the past 20 years. Where Paris parts company with some of its allies is that, again, it insists on the need for international legitimacy, preferably through an explicit UN Security Council resolution, even though France tends sometimes to have an extensive interpretation of what such resolutions allow for. At the same time, France has never been shy regarding the use of targeted but deadly military force on many occasions to protect its civilian, or its soldiers when they are directly attacked, even at the risk of civilian casualties. And let me give you just a few examples, because even though some of them are recent, they are not always well remembered. In 93, a retaliation against the Pasdaran and against Hezbollah after the Camp Draka bombing. In 96, after Gaddafi, after Libya committed another aggression in Chad. In 95, after the French forces, the French Blue Helmets were taken hostage by Serbian forces. In 2004, where the French destroyed the whole Ivory Coast Air Force. Well, that was 2 planes and 2 helicopters still. But still, we can say we destroyed the whole Air Force. That was in retaliation for the, quote, accident, quote, unquote, bombing of one of our military bases by some unknown force. And then I should also mention the recent actions, which were certainly not all successful, which were taken in the field of counter-piracy and counter-terrorism. When Somali pirates arraigned civilian boats, and in 2008, 2009, there were a couple, 2 or 3 different actions of reprisals, first of all, to get the hostages back, of course, but also for reprisals. There was a failed intervention against ACMI, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, recently. And one of the points of that intervention was actually, to quote a very high-level official that I spoke with, to send a deterrence message so that even if we are running the risk of losing the hostages, at least we will have sent a message that if you abduct French citizens, there will be a price to pay. While operating, as is the case for all democratic states, in an environment which is increasingly marked by legal constraints and media scrutiny, I think it is fair to say that the French forces are sometimes less burdened with caveats and restrictive rules of engagement. That is the case for some of our allies. I'm talking about some of our European allies. This may be, here again, partly a legacy of our colonial past, but also an important feature of the French system, of the fact that basically resorting to military force is a presidential prerogative with very, very few democratic checks and balances. There is very little role for the parliament to check the presidential power regarding the use of force. If one was to compare French strategies and tactics with those of its allies, I would think that it's possible to say that Paris tends to have a greater readiness to put the life of its soldiers at risk than some of its allies, provided that the possible costs are worth the risk. The need to exercise caution and use force discriminately to avoid excessive collateral damage to civilians has always been a constant feature. For instance, during the Kosovo War of 1999, Paris opposed the President, Chirac at that time, explicitly opposed the targeting of some key targets designated by NATO. So I would say in conclusion that in comparison with, for instance, the United States, which has different means, of course, the expression overwhelming force is definitely not part of the French military vocabulary, perhaps simply because we can't afford it, I don't know. That's one reason, but that may not be the only one. That may not be the only one. And on the contrary, I would say one specific characteristic of the French use of force is the tradition of trying to intermingle as much as possible with the local population in order, even if it means taking risk for the soldiers, which has been a favorite tactic for peacekeeping, stability operation, counterterrorism, or counter-insurgency operation. And as much as I hate to admit it, I think this may have been also a legacy of our colonial past. In conclusion, don't hold your breath for the French becoming now the super hawks, willing and able to defend civilian population everywhere they are threatened. I think the Libya operation is very contingent. I think it was an exceptional decision, in which perhaps the humiliation that Sarkozy received in 2007 by courtesy of Colonel Gaddafi may have played a part. I don't know. This is just a hypothesis. I'm just making this up. But this does not necessarily mean that it's a new French doctrine in the making. This is an exceptional contingent operation. I'm not sure it means that the French will be willing and able to do many other Libyas in the future. Thank you.